Yes, it was Monday.
I saw the time it was.
All right, wasn't last week. It was Monday. So go ahead, read through the case study if you haven't already, and then pull out those questions that I had given to you on Monday. I have a couple extras if you need them.
They probably told the precaution or something. Probably they would make us on FaceTime.
We got around to reading it, but we haven't discussed it yet.
My dorm. It's definitely my dorm. Oh my god. I cleaned out my folder yesterday. Crazy.
Everybody have access to questions? Oh, you have some? Yes.
My class schedule.
Alright, so go ahead and discuss with Taylor. What is going on with this guy?
Oh my god. What class? I'm just gonna grab the ISB and this textbook. Only cost me $20 to print. Does this look like the right textbook?
Yes, it is.
Oh, absolutely. Hold on, I'm gonna order it right now. So glad that I rented mine and it shipped me in like 2 days. Well, I ordered from the bookmark and then they were like, it'll be just a couple days, So I put off on it and then they were like, oh, canceled it, sorry. Yep. Yeah. Thanks. What? Should I tell my dad what I'm doing or should I just order it?
All right, have we had time to think about what's going on here? Anyone need more time? All right, let's think about it together. So, what do we think is going on here?
Alcoholic fermentation.
Alcoholic fermentation, all right. What's your reasoning behind it?
This man isn't drinking alcohol, but he's drunk.
All right, he isn't drinking alcohol, but he's drunk. All right. Anyone else have another explanation to what could be going on? All right, so we're pretty much in consensus with this alcohol fermentation. All right. So what organism is likely responsible?
Yeast. Or bacteria.
Mitochondria.
Yeast. Yeah, and yeast is probably in the gut because that's, where things are getting absorbed from what you're eating. All right. It's probably yeast because he has a history of home brewing. All right, so he has access to yeast in one aspect or another, and probably large amounts of it. Maybe he inhaled it accidentally. Who knows? All right. Is yeast anaerobic, aerobic, or a facilitative anaerobe? Both. Facilitated anaerobe. Yeah. They can either do fermentation or go through cellular respiration. All right. I'm not going to have you diagram all the inputs and outputs because we have other things to get to today. But how can this organism live on such small amounts of ATP? How can it still survive? Yeah. It's small. It's single-celled. It doesn't have huge energetic outputs. All right? So what's going on here is that somehow this guy got an infection in his gut of this yeast. All right? And every time he would eat something that's really high in carbohydrates, these yeast would go through alcohol fermentation and essentially get this guy drunk. All right? So this is kind of an isolated case. I put the actual news story up. They kind of labeled it auto brewery syndrome. All right? This guy had yeast in his gut. They put him in a hospital. They didn't give him any alcohol, but he was still getting drunk every time he ate something super carbohydrate intense. All right? So there's really great article on it. I linked it on the last PowerPoint slide if you want to learn more about it. All right, but he had yeast in his gut. All right. Any questions about that? Sounds good. Let's move on to photosynthesis. All right, I'm super excited to be doing photosynthesis because this is my wheelhouse. All right, so overview of photosynthesis. All right, we are using light energy to synthesize carbohydrates. And those carbohydrates are typically sugars. All right, so it's kind of the opposite of cellular respiration. All right, CO2 is being reduced. All right, it's being reduced. We're adding on hydrogens and electrons, being reduced into a sugar. This is glucose. Water is being oxidized. All right, so we're oxidizing this water into oxygen. All right, and this whole reaction is very endergonic. All right, we look at that Gibbs free energy. It's positive 685. All right, so it's a highly endergonic reaction. So it needs energy to help drive it. It's not going to happen spontaneously. That energy is coming from light. It's coming from the sun. All right? And so photosynthesis is part of this larger cycle on Earth, right? The energy cycle where we have cells that are going to use organic molecules, eat some sugars for their energy, right? Go through cellular respiration. They're going to, as a byproduct, release CO2 and water, which plants can use this CO2 and water along with sunlight to manufacture more sugar molecules, right? So it's this cycle of life going on here. Right? A nice byproduct is oxygen, right? So we should be very thankful that plants have the byproduct of oxygen, allowing us to live. All right, so plants are in a different trophic level than us. All right, so we are heterotrophs, right? We need to eat food in order to gain energy and sustain life. All right, so we need to eat carbohydrates. We need the glucose. We need to go through cellular respiration in order for us to live. Now, autotrophs, all right, they don't need to eat food because they can make their own food from inorganic sources. All right, so a common one, and one that we're going to talk about here, is a photoautotroph. They can use light as their source of energy in order to make their own food. There are other autotrophs such as chemiautotrophs. Right? Typically, some bacteria in the soil or some organisms living in the deep sea, they will use chemicals to synthesize their own food. All right? They are also an autotroph. We're going to focus on photoautotrophs. All right? They make their own food. So basically, if you look outside and see anything growing that's green, all right, they're an autotroph. They're a photoautotroph. They're using light energy to make sugars. All right? So trees, grass, bushes, what have you. Protists, these single-celled organisms, they can also make their own food, as well as kelp in the sea. All right, so kelp is a form of algae. They can make their own food. And cyanobacteria. All right, cyanobacteria are very interesting organisms. Cyanobacteria are thought to be the predecessor to the chloroplast organelle. All right, they make their own food. They can synthesize their own sugars. All right, just reiterating this again because it's such a big role. All right, we are going to capture light energy, store it in organic molecules, that other cells or maybe that same plant can utilize to create energy and release CO2. All right, so again, photosynthesis in chloroplasts, very endergonic. All right, it's not going to happen spontaneously. We need an energy output. Versus cellular respiration, which we had just talked about previously, that's exergonic. It's going to happen spontaneously. All right, so we have photosynthesis going on in plants, right? And we have this cycle going. But something that's often overlooked is that plants can also use cellular respiration. In fact, they would probably die if they did not also use cellular respiration, because they also need energy. They need energy to run their cellular processes. So they are using photosynthesis to make glucose, and then they're using cellular respiration to harvest the energy from the glucose that they just made. All right, so they're doing both. All right, a good example of this is what's happening right now. All right, so we have these trees that look like they're dying back. All right, they're going dormant. And so once they've lost all their leaves, they don't have those photosynthetic organs anymore. All right, so if they relied on photosynthesis, they would be dead. All right, so what's happening is that over the course of the summer, they've accumulated all this glucose from photosynthesis, stored it away, and now through the winter months, when they don't have their photosynthetic components, they're relying on cellular respiration to break down that stored glucose and keep them alive. All right, if they did not have their ability, they would die. All right, they wouldn't be able to sustain their energy needs. All right, so plant cells, they have chloroplasts and mitochondria. Chloroplasts are the organelles that we're going to focus on now, because this is where photosynthesis occurs. All right, so photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplasts, specifically in the mesophyll cells. All right, so we have this cross-section of a leaf here. Imagine we took a leaf, we chopped it in half. We looked at that very thin slice after we chopped it in half. This is what we would be looking at. All right, we'd have a top layer of cells, we'd have a bottom layer of cells, and then we'd have this middle layer. All right, this middle layer is depicted green because it contains the pigment chlorophyll. All right, these are the cells that contain chloroplasts. All right, they have chloroplasts. These are the cells that are going through photosynthesis, right, in the mesophyll layer. All right, now besides just being a closed-off leaf, all right, we need to have air movement. We need to have a supply of carbon dioxide and being able to release oxygen. All right, and that's going to happen typically on the bottom of the leaf in the stomata. All right, so the stomata are pores in the leaf that allow for gas exchange. All right, so we have our chloroplasts. Our chloroplast has our pigment chlorophyll where we are doing harvesting energy. All right, let's look at this anatomy a little bit more further. All right, so we have a chloroplast. The chloroplast is an organelle. All right, it's not a different cell. It's an organelle within the cell. It's very similar to a mitochondria in that it has two membranes, an inner and an outer, and then between those two membranes, it has that inner membrane space. Right? We see the same thing in mitochondria. Now, chloroplasts, they have a third membrane system, right? And this is important because this is where photosynthesis, the light reactions can occur. This is where they can harvest that light energy. All right? And that third membrane system are in these thylakoids. All right? So these thylakoids are these round discs. All right? They're essentially these fluid-filled sacs of membranes. All right? So inside of each thylakoid where the fluid is, we would call that the thylakoid lumen. All right, then we have the thylakoid membranes. And then outside of the thylakoid, we have the stroma, which is all the space surrounding the thylakoids inside the chloroplast. Now if we take a bunch of these thylakoid discs and stack them up, all right, we create these columns called granum. All right, and they all work together to harvest light energy to power the fixation of carbon dioxide. All right, so when we talk about photosynthesis, there's two stages. And we're going to go a little bit deeper on this on Friday. But there's the light reactions. All right, these are happening in the thylakoids, all right, in these thylakoid membranes. They are using the light energy, which is why they're called the light reactions. And they're producing ATP, as well as NADPH. right? So NADPH, very similar to NADH that we talked about in cellular respiration. They just have an additional phosphate group. But it acts the same way. It's an electron carrier. It can be easily reduced and oxidized. Right? A byproduct of the light reactions is oxygen. All right? We get oxygen from these reactions. Now ATP and NADPH, they're going to go into the Kelvin cycle, often called the dark reactions because they don't need light directly to work. All right? That happens in the stroma. All right? So that fluid surrounding the thylakoids. All right? They're using the ATP, they're using the NADPH, and creating sugars, all right? Taking carbon dioxide and fixing it into an organic molecule to create sugar. All right, so before we dive into the workings of photosynthesis, we have to understand light, all right? So light is a type of electromagnetic radiation. And I just realized I've been talking to you without presenting this, so let's make this bigger. All right, it's a type of electromagnetic radiation. All right, so it's called electromagnetic radiation because it relies on the electrical and the magnetic fields. And light travels as waves. Right? We've probably all seen this at this point. All right, the distance between two successive wave crests would be the wavelength. All right, so light is traveling as waves. We can have different types of wavelengths. They can be very short. They can be very long. All right, now light also behaves as a particle called a photon. All right, so we can think of a photon as this discrete package of energy. All right, it's a massless package, doesn't have any mass associated with it. It's just this package of energy coming from light. Right, it's kind of an abstract thing to think about. All right, but it's these photons that are going to help power photosynthesis. All right, now at shorter wavelengths, these discrete packets, these photons, are going to have more energy than if they were in a wavelength that had a larger wavelength between them. All right, so let's look at that. So the electromagnetic spectrum, all right, this is all possible wavelengths. All right, we have wavelengths that have very, very short wavelengths. All right, so gamma rays, X-rays, UV light, they're very short in their wavelength. So because they're very short, they have high amounts of energy. In fact, they have energy that is so high that it's very damaging. Right, so plants are not going to want to utilize this type of light because it's damaging. It can cause mutations in your DNA. It can cause cancers. Right? This is why we wear sunscreen when we go outside to block out those UV ray lights so we don't get skin cancer. All right? So they're damaging. Plants are not going to use those. All right? Now on the other end of the spectrum, we have infrared, we have microwaves, we have radio waves. All right? These have very long wavelengths, very low energy. All right? Plants are not going to utilize these wavelengths because there's just not enough energy in them. Right? Instead, we're focusing on the visible light spectrum. Right? And it's just this very narrow spectrum within the whole electromagnetic spectrum. Right? But we're focusing on visible light. All right, so plants can utilize visible light because they have enough energy to actually do something, but not so much energy that it's damaging. So how do they utilize this energy? All right, what is actually going on? All right, so we have these photons. They're these discrete packages, right? Now these photons, they can be absorbed, they can be transmitted, or they can be reflected when they strike an object. All right, so in this image here, we have a photon right here going in. It's being absorbed in our thylakoid membranes. Some of it is bouncing right off and being reflected. Some of it's just going right through. It's being transmitted right through the thylakoids, all right, not being used. All right, so the pigments in these thylakoids are the molecules that will absorb the wavelengths of light. And they're very specific to what wavelength they will absorb. All right, so we have our chloroplasts. Inside our chloroplasts, we have our thylakoids. Inside of the thylakoid membrane, we have our pigments. All right, and the pigments are responsible for harvesting this energy from photons. Now the leaves are green because they don't really utilize the energy in the green wavelengths. All right, the green wavelengths are either going to be transmitted through or they're going to be reflected off. All right, everything else is going to be absorbed, which is why we see leaves as being green. All right, so how do they absorb this energy? All right, this is where we're going to think back to in day one when we talked about different orbitals. All right, so when a photon hits these pigments, all right, absorption is going to occur that's going to boost an electron into a higher energy level. All right, so we have the photon coming in here, hitting this atom. All right, this electron is going to become excited. All right, it's going to go to an orbital that's further away from the nucleus. All right, we call that the excited state. All right, now this is really unstable. All right, this is not a very stable conformation for an atom to be in, for an electron to be in. So it's going to have to release this energy in some way in order to get back down to that ground state. Right? We can release that energy as heat. Right? So think about a hot tar on the black top. That energy that's being absorbed on the tar there is going to be released as heat. All right? We can release the energy as light. Right? That's called fluorescence. Some animals like jellyfish here go through biofluorescence. All right? And they can release the energy as light. But in photosynthesis, these excited electrons, they're actually going to be transferred to another molecule in order to be captured. All right. So we have our electron. It's in this excited state. We're going to transfer that energy from that electron to another molecule. All right, let's look at this a little bit more in depth. So when a photon strikes the chlorophyll, right, it's going to hit this pigment chlorophyll. That's going to excite the electrons. All right, so the energy is going to be transferred to an electron in the chlorophyll head, which we'll talk about in a second here. That electron becomes excited, and it's going to go to this very unstable, higher energy state. Now, in chlorophyll, all right, it's very specific to the pigment chlorophyll, red and blue photons can be absorbed. All right, so that's the part of the light spectrum that's going to be absorbed with these pigments. And that's going to excite the electrons to different states. Right? Because if we think about wavelengths again, right, if we look at the blue wavelength here, right, it's a very short wavelength. It contains more energy. It can excite that electron even further into a higher energy state. Versus red. All right, red can still excite these electrons. It's just not going to excite them as much. All right, so these lights, they work together, but they have different results. All right, so we're exciting these electrons in the chlorophyll head. All right, so this is an image of the chlorophyll pigment. All right, we have this tail. That's going to anchor the chlorophyll into the thylakoid membrane. And then we have this head structure. This is where light is going to be absorbed. All right, light's going to be absorbed in this head structure. Now we have two different types of chlorophylls that's shown here. Right, we have chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. That's just a difference of molecular structure at this one site. All right, so when we talk about chlorophyll, we're talking about two different pigments here. Now, once it hits this head and becomes excited, right, we know that we're not dissipating it as heat, we're not transferring it as light, we're actually moving these electrons to another molecule to be captured. And we can see that in this image here. All right, so here's a chlorophyll. We're exciting that electron. It's bouncing from chlorophyll to chlorophyll to chlorophyll until it finally reaches this protein that can utilize that excited electron and do further chemical reactions. All right, yes?
Would there be like multiple chlorophylls like that on the right in the cells? Or
Yes. In fact, I'm going to skip right ahead here. All right. They are often in groups. All right. So these chlorophylls are often in groups called antenna complexes. So these groups that will work together to bounce that electron back and forth until it reaches this reaction center. All right. So we have a lot of different chlorophylls embedded within the thylakoid membranes. And think about how many membranes are within one chloroplast. All right. So we have an amazing capacity to harvest light energy. All right. Now I'm going to switch back here and say that fluorescence and heat dissipation does occur, all right, but just very, very small amount. About 2% of those excited electrons produced can actually be emitted back as heat or light. So it does occur, but not to the extent of transferring electrons. And this act of transferring electrons is called resonance energy transfer. All right. So I circled the term here, but I did not bold it. It's a term you'll probably want to know. All right. And that's happening in these antenna complexes, mostly with chlorophyll, but we have other pigments that can aid this happening as well. All right. So once it reaches the reaction center, right, that electrons essentially has been captured and can be used to power different redox reactions, right, which we'll talk about more on Friday. All right, so we have chlorophyll, all right, but that's not the only pigment we have. There are a vast variety of pigments within leaves. All right, so we have these chlorophylls A and B. They are absorbing light at slightly different wavelengths. We also have accessory pigments such as carotenoids, right, that can absorb light at different wavelengths than the chlorophyll, right? So we're trying to maximize the amount of energy gain that we can have here, right? So they can essentially absorb that energy and transfer that excited electron onto chlorophylls. So we're extending the wavelength that's actually usable. They can also be used for protection, all right? So UV light is still hitting these plants just like it hits our skin, all right? And just like we apply sunscreen, plants have these pigments that can act as a sunscreen for the plant. All right, it helps protect the plant from these damaging rays. All right, so pigments are really cool. This is just a subset of things that can happen with pigments. All right, but these pigments are often in smaller quantities than chlorophyll. So right now it's fall. The leaves are changing colors. All right, chlorophyll is mostly the dominant pigment in the leaf. In the fall, those pigments, the chlorophyll is going to be broken down, absorbed back into the tree, and what's left behind are these accessory pigments. And these accessory pigments are typically going to be reds, yellows, oranges. All right, so that's what we're seeing in the fall, is all these accessory pigments being left behind. All right, so we have a lot of different pigments here. So depending on how we're talking about photosynthesis, you might see a couple of different graphs. All right, absorption versus the action spectrum. So the absorption spectrum is going to be all the wavelengths by all those different pigments. All right, so right down here we have all these different pigments. All right, we're showing each specific wavelength that it's going to be absorbing light. All right, it's different from the action spectrum. Action spectrum kind of condenses everything into one line. All right, and shows the overall rate of photosynthesis by the whole plant with all these specific wavelengths. All right, so there's a couple different graphs you might see relating to photosynthesis and light capture. Any questions? All right, I have a class activity, so we can stop lecturing and do some writing. All right, I'm going to pass around the sheet. All right, a couple easy questions, but it's also a good time to make sure that what I just told you makes sense. All right, so let me pass it around and go ahead and work together. It's not worth any points, it's just for your own study. Yes, there is a quiz on Friday. So the quiz on Friday will cover material from the last exam up until what we talked about today. And keep in mind, you also have that assignment due on Monday. And next week is the exam. So, good opportunity to ask questions.
I did the first question. I did not A question.
Yeah, so like these carotenoids, for example, they're going to kind of extend the wavelength. it will absorb light at a different wavelength. A plus a B. Yeah, right, expanding their capacity to absorb light. They can also be used as protection. Something totally different than photosynthesis. Protecting it from getting out. Don't need to know it, so that it exists. Yes. All right.
So
Wait,
there's
so how does so basically, this light's going to come in and it's going to capture it at that wavelength. That's going to excite that electron. And then they'll transfer that excited electron to fluoroplast or chlorophyll and chlorophyll. Just like we saw in that antenna. All right.
No, if there's a smaller the red one.